Hi, everyone. I'm Allison DeJager from List Self Storage and StoreTrack. And for those of you who aren't familiar, List is a property listing platform, and StoreTrack is a data resource to make informed decisions when evaluating markets. Welcome to our video chat. Today, we're discussing the differences between the US and UK markets. We're joined by John Lindsey of Lindsey Self Storage Group and Rock Hughes of Janus International. Hi, guys.
Hello.
Hey, thanks for having us, Allison.
Thank you for joining. So to get started, can you just tell us a little bit about you and your company and your experience in the industry? John, can you start?
Sure. Yeah. No, thanks again for having me. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Lindsey, co-founder and president of Lindsey Self Storage Group. My family's been in the self-storage business since 1969. Over a decade ago, I launched Lindsey Self Storage Group. We specialize in self-storage brokerage throughout the US, Europe, Southeast Asia, and Latin America.
Cool. Rock, can you tell us a little bit about you?
Also, thank you for having me,
Thank
Allison.
you for joining.
I've been in the industry. I know I'm dating myself at this point, but I've been in the industry now for 22 years as an operator, a supplier. I've worked at Janus now for about 12 years. Been on the other side of that with other suppliers as well, but real familiar with the construction aspect, the development aspect, as well as the component aspect as it pertains, to self-storage. And I've also done, stints over, overseas in the UK, Latin American markets, as well as here at home in the US market.
And I'm so excited to exploit both of your experiences and your expertise in the industry. So we're going to just get right to it. Deal-wise, what are investors prioritizing difference like in the US versus the UK and Europe?
Well, I guess I'll start on that. And I think one of the biggest challenges we see people going to the UK or Europe versus US, whether you're doing a deal in Florida or Texas, you're still getting phase one, a survey, PCA. In the UK or Europe, it is a totally different ballgame based on country, city. You've got language barriers, cultural barriers, different legal practices, currency trades. It's just a whole nother animal. So groups that are willing to go to the UK and Europe have to be extremely patient, have patient capital. Most of the groups we worked with have done other types of deals in the UK or Europe before anyway, and usually have to have significant boots on the ground presence in order to walk these through different municipalities, just due to the complexities of getting a deal done over there. I'm sure Rock's faced it in the development side, but it's a different beast, and it takes a lot longer over there than it does here stateside. Yeah,
I agree with what John's saying. It's I know a lot of people over in the UK and Latin American markets, and it is a lot more complex. The time frame, I would say, and John, please jump in here as you will, but the time frame we see here is typically anywhere from 12 to 18 months. Could be longer, depends on what municipality you're in. But when you're comparing the United States to the UK, or even the Latin American markets for that matter, one thing that John didn't mention was you have to, consider historical sites, because the complexity and there are a lot of challenges, especially if you're doing conversions or if you want to do demo and build something new, that has relevant historical meaning behind that. It's a lot more complex and could take you double that time. And John's right. You've got to have boots on the ground. You've got to know somebody or have somebody that knows the local municipalities, knows what needs to be done locally, because without that, you're basically just shooting in the dark. And it is a much more complex, much longer time frame, from start to finish doing, site inspection to actually picking out a site. Doing all your due diligence and then getting that from start to finish to where you're open and actually start renting units. It can be, a lot more cumbersome, no doubt about it.
Can you talk a little bit about, in the US, we have seen successful developments in what would be traditionally considered an oversupplied market. Do you think it's something that the UK can adopt, or is that too early to say?
I think the UK and Europe as a whole are way undersupplied still. They've got a very long runway. The UK is the most comparable to the US as far as advancement, but even then it's like early 2000s US. I mean, there is still just ample amount of runway, which is fantastic. Europe, obviously you get in some of those countries, it's, 0.1 square feet per capita. And I don't think it's ever going to get to 7 or 8, whatever
right.
metric you want to use. But I think 2 square feet per capita is where most of Western Europe will land. But I think one of the really limiting factors on top of what Rock mentioned with, all the complexities of municipalities and things like that too, is that the debt markets just aren't available there in Europe yet to do large self-storage lending projects. You're getting terrible terms, terrible rates, basically to pay cash unless you have some American group that wants to come over and lend to you, just because they still look at it as like this back of the trailer park asset class over there. So even if you're building some big, beautiful Class A, debt has been an extremely limiting factor on top of all the other complexities. So I think that's why we haven't seen these huge saturation booms in a lot of these countries yet, just because, again, of the overall structure that goes into trying to get one of these things built.
Yeah, and I would say too, with the banking side of it, there is what I would call an educational factor. We've been doing this for, it depends on who you ask, but self-storage, and we've probably been doing this at least 60 years, from chain link fences to 180,000 square foot, 7 stories at this point or whatever. Over there, it's still, well, what is self-storage? But, in the UK now that they've probably been doing it, I would say probably 20 plus years, that's gotten a lot easier, a lot softer. But there is still, like John's saying, it's a lot of the banks, a lot of the debt, servicing out there is still, what exactly are you doing again? We don't know what that is. You ask anybody in self-storage, what is self-storage, and doesn't matter who you ask, we all know what that is.
Yeah.
But I would say the one other thing is, when I was, going over to the UK, about 5 years ago, talking about just supply, they compared the UK to the state of Arizona as far as how many facilities, were operational. And I think at the time, maybe in Arizona, there might have been like 800 or 900 at that time. So if you take that into consideration, there is a huge, like John's saying, a huge runway, for the UK markets, Latin American markets, pretty much the rest of the world, because they've kind of adopted this, later in the game. So there is still a lot of opportunity.
That's really interesting. I see the similarities too, because of that, like how consumer driven both our countries or both our continents really are. That's kind of important. Can you talk about the value of information sharing?
Yeah, so I think especially in Europe and the UK, we've really seen this huge wave stateside in the past decade of, I would say, good, reliable information. So you can only imagine in, the further east you move in Europe, how little information there is, and even getting demographics information, let alone storage saturation, has been difficult. So we love when List comes in and is able to start to provide structure and shape to that and give us some guidance as to what's happening there, because it's a very virgin market and people are trying to figure out what is the standard, what is the barometer. Like, I have no idea what rates are or saturation. My closest competitor is about as close as I can get here, and that might be 20 minutes on the other side of town. So right. I think the more that people start to contribute to this, it's a rising tide raises all ships mentality. It's just going to continue to improve new entrants coming in and ensuring that they're not overstepping in a certain part of the market, that they're building with the right rates in mind so that we don't have failing projects, which then, really brings down the whole industry. So I think the more that people can contribute data and be a little more open with that in the UK and Europe, will continue to feed that beast and make it a more mainstream product over there like it is in the US.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree. It's the one thing I would say, and John, I'm sure you've seen this too, is, and I haven't been really involved over in the UK in the last 5 years, but, I still consider that in its infancy, and, people over there were a lot more tight-lipped because they still wanted to be the first in, kind of the first, even though it had been going on 15 years, whatever. It was a little more hesitation to actually share, how do you do this? You ask anybody in the United States and, oh, let me show you this, let me show you that. Now, that doesn't pertain to all. However, there is a lot more, I would say, data sharing, willingness, to help somebody, especially if they're not just, competing in their 1-3-5 mile area, to where their business is. But I feel like, the US, because it is such a well-known asset class today, that, and everybody realizes that. I mean, you look at the institutional players that have come in over the last, 7 to 10 years, and, everybody's a lot more willing, at least. And I'll ask John, are you seeing that today in the UK? Because, when I was there 5 years ago, there was some sharing, and you would really get that at like a lunch and learn, or the FEDESA, or one of the major shows, in one of the countries over there. You might get some one-on-one time with a big developer or something like that, but you had a lot smaller group of what I would say main developers. And when I mean main or big time developers, 10 plus stores, because nobody over there has 100.
No, and I think we are starting to see that transition now. From when I first went to my first FEDESA show in 2013, 2014 to now, I think there's started to be this more international migration of acquiring and building there. And with that has come this practice of like, hey, I'm going to show you what we're doing. And I think it's helped open up the dialogue there. And there are a number of operators that I've presented with internationally from Spain and China and Italy and the UK. And I think as we've started to kind of have these different touch points at different trade shows and conferences, the European and UK market has become much more open to sharing data and information, and realizing again that what's good for you is good for me, and what's good for me is good for us. And so it started to kind of build out there. And of course, it's a slower uptake, but the more major players that we're starting to see develop in major markets are helping fuel the growth, because so many people in Europe still don't even know what storage is.
I know.
And so it's like, listen, if you're getting in now, you're still in a great spot. So you might as well just help the industry.
Right. And going back to what you said earlier about, the debt, it's hard to get, these banks to move. Yeah. We've seen that institutional, player, come over and want to be involved, and that's opened some avenues. And I think that's opened some eyes of the mainstayers there in the UK to say, hey, yeah, come and help me. I need this. I can't seem to get any traction, going my, traditional way, but hey, I would love to have you involved, because like you said, over here, we've been doing it so much longer, and they have been more open, and more willing to share that. So I do think that's opened up the channels as well.
Absolutely.
I do want to mention too, like, SSA, SSA UK, FEDESA, those are all such great resources. To lean into those, I think it's just so important. I want to add, though, that the three of us have all heard at SSA or at ISS, the person who comes up within the past few years was like, I really want to get into self-storage. And you're like, go to, like, this is you think about it, like, that's the time machine. It's just be in Europe right now, be in the UK. That's your time machine.
And it's I'll say it's a great group. It's one of my favorite shows to go to every year. Rennie and the team have done a great job building that up over the years. And there's just so many great key players from Spain, the Netherlands, UK, that all contribute and make it, this really great, like, intimate show. There's 400 people there, which sounds small compared to the US, but when you think about how many countries are represented in that room at one time, it's a great show. Highly recommend anyone going, whether they're in Europe, stateside, wherever. Just a great exposure piece to what's happening over there.
Well, we did a really great global. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, those shows, like John said, it may seem smaller from an amount of people, but you have the amount of people that are wanting to do something. Yep. They're not just, it's not really an exploratory event for them. Some it may be, but these are people that have probably heard of storage. They might have already been to an event, at the ISS, maybe here in Vegas, or SSA, whatever it may be. And now they're starting to get more involved in their local, events, or their major FEDESA event over in Europe, because it's, it is a great show. And really what you're getting out of that is you're getting owners, developers, people that are, want to know, how do I do this? It's not, can I do this? It's how do I get going? Mm-hmm. At least that's what I've, experienced, going to those shows, and hopefully I'll get to go back to one of Rennie's shows here before too long, and not so distant future for sure.
I love that. That's great. I want to switch gears just a little bit, and kind of, John, I'm targeting you with this question. Can you share your thoughts relative to the brokerage process? So, exposure, valuations, like networking with vetted buyers.
Yeah. So I think, in the US, it is such a common step because we've been through multiple generations and cycles of selling self-storage. Whether institutional or individual owner, it is very standard practice to work with brokers. We know all the buyers, we understand the process. We do hundreds of these transactions a year. That is what people hire us to do best, just like when selling your home. And I think when we first started helping European UK groups, they were a little hesitant to the process, not from a brokerage standpoint, but from a sales standpoint, period. You got to think this industry is in such an infant stage there. A lot of builders and owners started these businesses just as a source of income. They never built it with the intention of selling like the institutional groups do here. So on our end too, it's also been an educational piece to say, hey, you have this business. You don't have to just pass it to your kids or shut it down when they don't want to take over it. Like, we can help you sell this to create generational wealth. And so on our end too, it's been a lot of that education piece saying like, look, here's an alternative exit for when you don't want to run this anymore. We have buyers that, buy in the UK and Europe. Here's our process. We're copy and pasting the same thing we're doing in the US and doing it in Europe and UK, and adding a formality to what was otherwise a very loose process beforehand. So it's been a great, I think, teaching opportunity for us too, to say like, look here, we can help you through this. We'll show you what your site's worth. And we know the groups that will perform. So we're protecting them from the unknown, which they, otherwise wouldn't know who to trust or who to sell to or who to.
And that's extremely important. That's extremely important because a lot of people just want to throw money at it.
Yep. And I think one of the biggest things is, Rockton is too, like there's so many people that have wanted to make that jump into the UK and Europe. And unless you really know what you're doing, you could lead someone down the wrong path, unintentionally. So we're here to be that layer of defense. Not only are we helping you, maximize your value of sale, but we're also saying like, look, we can vet these buyers for you. We don't want to waste your time either. So I think that's where, we always tell people more than anything, we're your best line of defense in order to maximize your best value. And that's what we bring to this process. And we've done it in the States, and now we've been able to kind of make that process happen through Europe. And it's the same with Rocking them. Anyone wants to build, it's why not go with the group that has absolutely dominated the space stateside and has perfected it in the UK and Europe, rather than trying to cut a corner or go some other group, a group who has done this time and time again.
Absolutely. And then Rock, I wanted to ask you about like any big hurdles for developing, which we kind of did touch on already, but I'm thinking of like considerations to be mindful of in the US versus the UK and Europe.
Well, I get this question all the time. Well, I have a site, and I'm sure John's heard this a million times too. And my first question is, what have you done with the site? Well, I've owned this land for 30 years, or my family's owned this land for 30 years, and it's a great site. Well, how do you know it's a great site? And the first thing I always allude to is, look, you need to bring in an expert. Take your personal bias out of this. I know it means something to you. Your grandparents own it. It's been in the family for generations. Bring in an expert. Bring somebody in. Take your personal bias out of this. Let them do the legwork. Let them go out. Let them evaluate that piece of property. Let them see what the competition's doing around you. Let's take an unbiased approach. Let the expert, fill in all the blanks, do a feasibility study. And before you go and spend millions of dollars, and I mean millions of dollars because it's not cheap, do a feasibility study for $25,000 and at least have peace of mind so you can sleep at night. Nothing is a guarantee, nothing, but you want to do that just to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward. and typically when I have those conversations, I'm sure John has them all the time too. That's the route they go, because it gives them peace of mind. And like I said, nothing's perfect, nothing's guaranteed, but at least they know they have a shot. And I've been involved with some that, say, well, it's kind of this or that, and maybe it's not the right time. Maybe you need to wait a year or two. Is there any new development coming in, any new house homes? Because really it's all about rooftops, right? And well, there's a new, this, that, or the other. Well, how many people are you going to get in that 135-mile radius from a rooftop perspective? We typically use an average of 10%, in a 135-mile radius of rooftops of what you'll probably get. Now, obviously, if you're building a 400, unit facility and there's 4,000 rooftops, it's probably a good, depending on what the competition is around you and what the rates are and what the capacities are of that competition, that may be a good deal. I'd have to see it all just like John does to kind of vet that out and see. But to me, that's the most critical point because I get that all day, every day. The construction side of it is depending on what you want to build, and that feasibility study will tell you the capacity of which it recommends to build based on what's you're competing with around you.
Can you repeat that? The capacity of what you want to build. Okay. All right.
Yeah. So it really tells you, if there's, if that surrounding area is good and it can allow for just say 50,000 square feet. Well, maybe if there's nobody else building that's going to open before you, maybe 50,000 square feet is what you want to build in that first phase. Now you could do another phase depending on rent up and, debt service and all that. But, maybe that's what you want to build phase one to start off with. But you always want to know those little intricacies, the median income, in those areas, the traffic counts. You've got to know those particulars, to help you make, an educated decision, to go forward or to hold off for right now, or just to look for another piece of property because it may not be the right site. I know today, and John can probably allude to this as well, and I'm just going to say, I'm just going to pick Florida, for instance. There's a huge exodus from the Northeast, obviously out West, there's an exodus, going to other places, Idaho, Montana, but Florida, just because you find a spot on a corner doesn't mean that it's just the best spot because you got to know what you're competing with, and, I used to use this as a rule of thumb. I did this, I won't mention the guy's name, but a guy that I used to deal with did feasibility studies for McDonald's. And that's what in McDonald's, I mean, the feasibility studies can be 1,000 pages.
And they're the best.
And they do them, I mean, it is crazy good. But I said, how do you find your sites? And this was early on, probably 15, 18 years ago. And he says, well, I used to do feasibilities for McDonald's. And he says, so I look, if there's a McDonald's, I probably did the feasibility on it, and I probably know where all these are. And then I'll canvas that, local area, go out maybe 5 miles and just see what I'm dealing with. Back in those days, he would pull yellow pages, and look and see who's advertising, A storage or A1 storage, whatever it may be, in the yellow pages, because back then that's what everybody kind of went with because they want to be first in the yellow pages. So everybody did an A in front of whatever they called it. And so, he said, I kind of rule of thumb for me was if there was a McDonald's, I basically, I did that, which, you can't really do that now because if there is a McDonald's, there's probably a storage facility somewhere there pretty close.
Yeah.
But, I see it all the time, build it in Florida and it may turn out good. But there's still no guarantee if you don't do, there's no guarantee in any of it, but I always highly recommend do the feasibility study, take your personal bias out of it. Let the expert come back to you and give you an educated recommendation of what they think is the right thing to do. Not everything's perfect, but at least that gives you peace of mind to know that before you go and spend that $1 million, you feel good about the opportunity. And then really it's how you make it work after that point, marketing to advertise, all of that, your management, how are you going to do that? So and I always tell everybody, try to differentiate yourself, no matter what it is, don't just have, your traditional, if everybody else in the area's got traditional, maybe you want to throw some boat and RV on there. Maybe you want to look at, something a little bit different that may not be in that local area. There's a plethora of different things you can do to differentiate yourself to stand out. And I'm sure John and his team, I'm sure they do the same thing, because now I see facilities, 15 years ago it was all single story, 80,000 square feet. Now, I see things that are seven stories, 180, 200,000 square feet. I had one client that wanted to build 317,000 square feet, one site. And I said, have you done a feasibility study? No, I've just owned this land for 30 years and I know it's good. It's in Florida.
Oh,
And I said, well, you might want to just reconsider, because by the time you fill that up or you're covering debt service, now he owned the land, so that was a plus going in. But I said, you might want to just reconsider, a smaller footprint, because there's probably some of the institutional players as well as other independent owners that realize where you're trying to build is probably a good idea. And just make sure it's not oversaturated, and see what's coming down the pipe. And you can get that at your local municipalities, finding out what permits have been pulled. That's all public information to see what's coming as far as development goes. And before you go and build that monstrosity, you might want to just do your homework, and maybe build a smaller footprint. And so, pretty much that's what's happening.
Thank you. I have one more question. I want to kind of chat about like any opportunities to learn from some mistakes that we've made in a more mature market, US, where we've seen some areas where it's like a longer lease up period. John, can you start?
yeah, it certainly can. I think one of the biggest mistakes that kind of goes hand in hand with what Rock said, get a feasibility study done, but also when you go to build, if there's an opportunity to phase your development out, especially in Europe and UK, we've just seen overall a longer lease up period than we do stateside on average. So even if the feasibility study says you're good for 50, 75, 100,000 feet, which would be great, maybe start at 40, then do another 20 as you need it. But it's just, and I would advise my clients in the state, same thing. It always gives me heartburn when they're going to build 100,000 square foot slug at once. They've got a lot more confidence than I do in the debt market to ride that interest carry for a long time. So I've always just been a big fan of, if there's an opportunity to slow play and to cover your own behind, then that's a good way to do it. This is supposed to be a generational wealth tool, not your 10x get rich quick overnight. So why don't we treat it like that, and be conservative and, cover your bases as you go through this process.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a big thing that we share as well. And phasing it in. Now, I'm not saying build 10,000 square feet at one time.
Yeah.
But if you can get to that 40 or 50 to start, because you got to think you're going to take 20-25% out of that for hallways, for mechanical rooms, offices, all of that stuff. So you want to start off, if you can, somewhere around that 40 to 60,000 square feet. And like John says, if you can do 100,000 square feet, phase it in, because the biggest unknown, and these unit mixes that we all do, based on historical data, based on, data that's been provided in states and what we've done in the past, because we have very diverse unit mixes. But the one unknown is, what is going to be your unit mix going forward? Because if you build it all out at one time, a lot of times it's hard to cater to somebody that might need another 10 by 15. And if you don't build enough 10 by 15s, in that, if you build it all at once, then you're going back and you're having to change things. So it's much easier to phase it, because, after the first phase, that gives you a clear indication of what your second phase, and then so on and so forth, as to what your unit mix, for that specific area should be. Because you're going to have clientele that come in and say, hey, well, I need this. Do you have it? Well, yeah, or no. And you don't want to be in that situation where you tell them no, because what they're doing at that point, is they're going right down the street. So you want it as diverse as it can possibly be, but then when you phase 2, phase 3, whatever it is, that's going to give you an indication of what needs to be built in those additional phases to support your clientele. I couldn't agree more on the phasing side.
Very well said. Before we shut down, John, can you share your contact information in case anyone has any additional questions?
Everyone can find us lindseyselfstoragegroup.com. I'm also on WhatsApp. If any of the UK and Euro operators want to get in touch, you can find my phone number on the website. Email is john@lindseyselfstoragegroup.com. Would love to chat with anyone who needs some help.
And that's
And
Lindsey as in SEY. And then Rock, can you share
Thank
yours?
you, Allison.
Yeah, mine is obviously name's Rock Hughes. My email is rockhughes@janusintl.com or rhughes, HUGHES @janusintl.com. Phone number 678-409-1831. I'm also on WhatsApp, so feel free to reach out to me anytime.
Perfect. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Allison.
You can reach me at 248-795-8126, or my email is Allison, ALISON @listselfstorage.com. Thanks.